Vedic Sanskrit is an Old Indo-Aryan language. It is the spoken ancestor of liturgical Sanskrit and an early descendant of Proto-Indo-Aryan. It is closely related to Avestan, the oldest preserved of the Iranian languages. Vedic Sanskrit is the oldest attested language of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European languages. Vedic Sanskrit is the language of the Vedas texts compiled over the period of early to mid-2nd to mid-1st millennium BCE. It was orally preserved as a part of the Rota tradition of Vedic chanting, predating the advent of alphabetic writing in India by several centuries. For lack of both epigraphic evidence and an unbroken manuscript tradition, Vedic Sanskrit is one of the languages that cannot be translated accurately in this age, especially the oldest stage of the language. Rig Vedic Sanskrit, the language of the hymns of the Rig Veda, is preserved only in a redacted form several centuries younger than the text's composition. Recovering its original form is a matter of linguistic reconstruction. From about the 4th century BCE, in the classical period of Iron Age India, Vedic Sanskrit gave way to classical Sanskrit as defined by the grammar of Panini. History. Prehistoric derivation. In spite of being comparatively close to the reconstructed form of the Proto-Indo-Aryan language, extant Vedic Sanskrit is already clearly marked as a language of the Indic group. Among the phonological changes from Proto-Indo-Aryan is the loss of the Z and Z phonemes, and the introduction of a series of retroflex consonants. For example, Proto-Indo-Aryan *nizda nest gives Vedic nida resting place, seat, abode, involving both the loss of *z and the substitution of the retroflex d for *d. On the side of vocabulary, Rig Vedic Sanskrit shows a considerable number of loanwords taken from an indigenous Indian source. This substratum influence on early Vedic Sanskrit also extends to phonetic, morphological and syntactical features, and is variously traced to the Dravidian and Munda language families. The separation of the Indo-Aryan peoples proper from the undifferentiated Proto-Indo-Aryan ancestor group is commonly dated on linguistic grounds to roughly 1800 BCE. The composition of the oldest hymns of the Rig Veda is dated to several centuries after this division, or to roughly 1500 BCE. Both Ascopiapola and J. P. Mallory placed the locus of the division of Indo-Aryan from Iranian in the Bronze Age culture of the Bactria-Marjana archaeological complex. Parpola elaborates the model and has Proto-Rig Vedic Indo-Aryans intrude the BMAC around 1700 BCE. He assumes early Indo-Aryan presence in the late Harappan horizon from about 1900 BCE, and Proto-Rig Vedic intrusion to the Punjab as corresponding to the Gandhara grave culture from about 1700 BCE. According to this model, Rig Vedic Sanskrit within the larger Indo-Aryan group is the direct ancestor of the Dardic languages. The hymns of the Rig Veda are thus composed in a sacred language which was based on the natural language spoken in Gandhara during the early phase of the Gandhara grave culture at the end of Bronze Age India. This liturgical language over the following centuries came to be separated from spoken vernaculars and came to be known as the artificial or elaborated language, contrasted to the natural or unrefined Prakritha vernaculars by the end of the Vedic period. Chronology. 5 chronologically distinct strata can be identified within the Vedic language. Rig Vedic. The Rig Veda retains many common Indo-Iranian elements both in language and in content that are not present in any other Vedic texts. Its creation must have taken place over several centuries, and apart from the latest books, it must have been essentially complete by around the 12th century BCE. Mantra language. This period includes both the mantra and prose language of the Atharva Veda, the Rig Veda Kalani, the Samaveda Samhita, and the mantras of the Yajurveda. These texts are largely derived from the Rig Veda, but have undergone certain changes both by linguistic change and by reinterpretation. Conspicuous changes include change of Visva, all, to Sava, and the spread of Kuru as the present tense form of the verb kar, make, do. This period corresponds to the early Iron Age in northwestern India, and to the Kuru kingdom, dating from about the 12th century BCE. Samhita prose. This period marks the beginning collection and codification of the Vedic canon. An important linguistic change is the complete loss of the injunctive and of the grammatical moods of the aorist. The commentary part of the Black Yajurveda belongs to this period. Brahmana prose. The Brahmanas proper of the four Vedas belong to this period, as well as the Aranyakas, the oldest of the Upanishads. Sutra language. This is the last stratum of Vedic Sanskrit leading up to 500 BCE, comprising the bulk of the Rauta Sutras and Graya Sutras and some Upanishads. Around 500 BCE, cultural, political and linguistic factors all contribute to the end of the Vedic period. The codification of Vedic ritual reached its peak, and counter-movements such as the Vedanta and early Buddhism emerged, using the vernacular Pali, a Prakrit rather than Sanskrit for their texts. Darius I invaded the Indus Valley, and the political center of the Indo-Aryan kingdoms shifted eastward to the Indo-Gangetic plain. Around this time, Panini fixes the grammar of classical Sanskrit. The pronunciation of Odia language speakers are more closer to Vedic Sanskrit than any other language of India. The Odia language is the only language of Indo-Aryan language family declared as one of the 6 classical languages of India. Phonology. This section treats the distinguishing features of Vedic Sanskrit. See Classical Sanskrit for a general account. Sound changes between Proto-Indo-Iranian and Vedic Sanskrit include loss of the voice sibilant z. Vedic Sanskrit had a bilabial fricative, called Upadmanya, and a velar fricative, called Jivamalya. These are both allophones of Visarga. Upadmanya occurs before P and PH, Jivamalya before K and KH. Vedic also had a retroflex L, an intervocalic allophone of D, represented in Devanagari with the separate symbol and transliterated as L or LH. In order to disambiguate vocalic L from retroflex L, ISO 15919 transliterates vocalic L with a ring below the letter L. Vedic Sanskrit had a pitch accent. Since a small number of words in the late pronunciation of Vedic carry the so-called independence Varita on a short vowel, one can argue that late Vedic was marginally a tonal language. Note, however, that in the metrically restored versions of the Rig Veda, almost all of the syllables carrying an independence Varita must revert to a sequence of 2 syllables, the first of which carries an udatta and the second a dependence Varita. Early Vedic was thus definitely not a tonal language but a pitch accent language. See Vedic accent. Panini gives accent rules from the spoken language of his time, though there is no extant post-Vedic text with accents. The Pluti vowels were on the verge of becoming phonological during Middle Vedic but disappeared again. Principal differences from Classical Sanskrit. Vedic Sanskrit differs from Classical Sanskrit to an extent comparable to the difference between Homeric Greek and Classical Greek. Tiwari lists the following principal differences between the two. Vedic Sanskrit had a voiceless bilabial fricative and a voiceless velar fricative, which used to occur when the breath Visarga appeared before voiceless labial and velar consonants respectively. Both of them were lost in Classical Sanskrit to give way to the simple Visarga. Vedic Sanskrit had a retroflex lateral approximant as well as its aspirated counterpart L, which was lost in Classical Sanskrit. The vowels I and O were actually realized in Vedic Sanskrit as diphthongs I and O, but they became pure monophthongs E and O in classical Sanskrit. The vowels I and O were actually realized in Vedic Sanskrit as hiatus AI and U, but they became diphthongs I and O in classical Sanskrit. The Pratishakas claimed that the dental consonants were articulated from the root of the teeth, but they became pure dentals later. This included the R, which later became retroflex. Vedic Sanskrit had a pitch accent which could even change the meaning of the words, and was still in use in Panini's time, as can be inferred by his use of devices to indicate its position. Later, it was replaced by a stress accent limited to the second to fourth syllables from the end. Vedic Sanskrit often allowed two-like vowels to come together without merger by sandhi. Grammar. Vedic had subjunctive mood absent in Panini's grammar and generally believed to have disappeared by then, at least in common sentence constructions. All aspects could be conjugated in the subjunctive and optative moods, in contrast to classical Sanskrit, with no subjunctive and only a present optative. The three synthetic past tenses were still clearly distinguished semantically in Vedic, although not at all with the semantics that would be implied by the name. Rather, the imperfect was a narrative tense similar to the Greek aorist. The perfect was often indistinguishable from the present tense, although possibly with a stative meaning, and the aorist had a meaning similar to the Greek perfect. A fifth mood, the injunctive, also existed. Long I stems differentiate the deviant vrkis feminines, a difference lost in classical Sanskrit. The subjunctive mood of Vedic Sanskrit was also lost in classical Sanskrit. Also, there was no fixed rule about the use of various tenses. There were more than 12 ways of forming infinitives in Vedic Sanskrit, of which classical Sanskrit retained only one form. Nominal declinations and verbal conjugation also changed pronunciation, although the spelling was mostly retained in classical Sanskrit, e.g., along with the classical Sanskrit's declension of deva as deva, deva. Vedic Sanskrit additionally allowed the forms deva, deva, devasa. Similarly, Vedic Sanskrit has declined forms such as asme, tve, usme, tva, etc. The first and second person pronouns, not found in classical Sanskrit. The obvious reason is the attempt of classical Sanskrit to regularize and standardize its grammar, which simultaneously led to a purge of old Proto-Indo-European forms. Proto-Indo-European and its immediate daughter languages were essentially end-inflected languages in which what would later become bound prefixes were still independent morphemes. Such morphemes could come anywhere in the sentence, but in classical Sanskrit, it became mandatory to attach them immediately before the verb. They then ceased being independent morphemes and became prefix morphemes bound to the beginnings of verbs. There was a similar development from Homeric Greek to Ancient Greek, ctmesis.